"This photo is of our house," the girls told the millionaire. But moments later, they discover something terrible. Comment what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10 and tell me which city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story and get to know you better. So subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Arthur Blackwood's office when the doorbell echoed through the empty mansion. 52 years of life had taught him to be wary of unannounced visitors, especially when it came to the most valuable property in his real estate portfolio. The $20 million house in the Green Valley Estates neighborhood had been on the market for only 2 weeks, and the realtors knew they were to schedule any visit well in advance. Arthur descended the marble staircase with firm steps, adjusting his tie. His morning routine was always the same: black coffee, a review of contracts, and an analysis of purchase offers. 15 years had passed since he lost everything in the bankruptcy of the family business, and every business decision since had been calculated with mathematical precision. There was no room for sentimentality in his real estate empire. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. When he opened the heavy, fine wood door, Arthur found 2 little girls standing on the porch. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with tangled brown hair and simple clothes that had seen better days. One of them clutched a worn-out blanket to her chest, while the other kept her large eyes fixed on his face. "This is our house," said the girl with the blanket, her voice small but firm. Arthur blinked, confused. "What do you mean, girls? Are you lost? I'm Catherine, and she's Isabel," the first child continued, pointing to her sister. "We live here, in the room with the butterfly wallpaper." A shiver ran down Arthur's spine. The property had been decorated by the former owner with children's themes in some rooms, including a room with butterfly wallpaper that he had never shown to anyone. It was located on the 2nd floor, away from the main area of the house. "Girls, I think you're confused," he said, crouching down to their level. "This house has been empty for years. Where are your parents?" Isabel, who had remained silent, took a step forward. "Mommy said this was our house forever. She cried a lot when we had to leave." "And the rose garden is still back there," added Catherine, letting go of her sister's hand and walking with familiarity toward the side of the property. "Mommy watered the red flowers every morning." Arthur stood up abruptly. The rose garden had been cultivated by the previous decorator and maintained by gardeners even after the change of ownership. It was impossible for 2 young children to know about it without having lived there. But the property records were clear. No one had resided in the house for the last 5 years, since he acquired it from a family in financial trouble. "Come on, let's sit down for a bit," he said, gesturing for them to come inside. "I need to understand this situation better." The girls exchanged glances and followed Arthur into the house. Catherine moved through the corridors as if she knew every inch of the place, while Isabel stayed closer to her sister, observing everything carefully. "The kitchen had an owl-shaped cookie jar on top of the fridge," said Catherine, stopping at the entrance to the gourmet kitchen. "And there was a little yellow stool for us to reach the sink." Arthur felt his blood run cold. He had found an owl-shaped cookie jar in one of the cabinets during his first inspection of the property, along with other personal items he assumed had been forgotten by the previous residents, and there really was a yellow stool in the house's storage. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice more tense. "Because we lived here with Mommy," Isabel answered simply. "She worked a lot to pay the rent. Sometimes she cried in the shower when she thought we weren't listening." The girl's words hit Arthur like a punch. Rent? That was impossible. He was the sole owner of the house, and he had never authorized any lease. The documents were all in his name, registered with the county. "Girls, tell me something," he said, sitting in one of the living room armchairs. "When did you live here?" How long ago? Catherine climbed onto one of the armchairs with the ease of someone who had always done so. A long time. Isabel was still in diapers when we arrived. Now she knows how to use the toilet by herself. And our friend Laura lived in the room next door, added Isabel. She had a talking doll and shared cookies with us. Arthur ran his hands over his face, trying to process the information. If the girls were telling the truth, it meant that several people had lived on his property without his knowledge, but how was that possible? Where have you been lately? Where did you sleep last night? In the place, with lots of beds and crying children, said Catherine, her smile fading. The lady there said our mum wasn't coming to get us anymore, but we know she'll come back. She always comes back, Isabel agreed, clutching the blanket to her chest. Arthur's heart ached. The girls had clearly run away from some shelter or institution. He needed to contact the authorities, but something in their sincerity made him hesitate. There were details too specific to be the invention of such young children. Do you remember your mother's name? Christine, they answered in unison. Christine who? The girls looked at each other, confused. Just Christine, said Catherine, but everyone called her Chris. Arthur got up and walked to the window, looking. At the rose garden the girls had mentioned, the red flowers were in full bloom, cared for by the gardeners he paid to maintain the property. If someone had really lived there without his authorization, he needed to find out how and when it had happened. Girls, I'm going to make a few calls, okay? You stay here for now. Are you hungry? Always, replied Isabel, and for the first time, she smiled genuinely. Arthur prepared simple sandwiches and served milk for the children, watching how they moved around the house with unsettling familiarity. Catherine knew exactly where the plates were in the kitchen, and Isabel pointed to the spot where Mommy kept the colorful cups. While the girls ate, Arthur called his lawyer. The conversation was brief but enlightening. It would be necessary to investigate the property records for the last few years and check for any documentation of leases he was unaware of. The second call was to social services in Aspen. After explaining the situation, he was instructed to stay with the children until a social worker could come to the location. My name is Martha Evans. I'm a social worker, said the woman who arrived 2 hours later. I received information about 2 girls who appeared at your property. Arthur told her everything that had happened, while Martha watched Catherine and Isabel play in the living room with impressive ease. They ran away from the municipal shelter at dawn, Martha explained. They came to us 2 months ago, found wandering the streets alone. They had no documentation, and all our efforts to locate family have been fruitless. And what about their mother, Christine? We have no record of any Christine who has looked for them. The girls constantly talk about a big house with a rose garden, but we assumed it was childhood fantasy to cope with the trauma of abandonment. Arthur looked at the 2 children, who had found some books on a shelf and were flipping through the pages together. What if it wasn't a fantasy? What if they really lived here? Martha stared at him skeptically. Mr. Blackwood, are you sure no one has had access to your property in recent years? Absolutely, he replied, but a nagging doubt was beginning to form in his mind. There were long periods when he traveled for business, leaving the property under the care of only the gardeners and the security company, and his ex-wife Renee had keys to all his properties. Renee, who had mysteriously disappeared 5 years ago, taking his savings and leaving only a cold, formal farewell letter. I need a few days to investigate this situation, Arthur said finally. Can the girls stay with me temporarily? Martha hesitated. It's irregular, but given the circumstances and the fact that they clearly feel at home here, I can authorize temporary guardianship for 1 week, but daily follow-up will be necessary. That night, Arthur prepared the butterfly room for the girls, who settled in as if they had never left. While they slept, He stayed awake, sifting through every document related to the property. It was then that Catherine appeared at the office door, barefoot and holding her blanket. "Uncle Arthur," she said, using the affectionate term for the first time, "do you know where Mommy kept our pictures?" "What pictures, honey?" "The ones she hid in the wall behind the mirror in her room. She said it was our secret treasure." Arthur felt his heart race. There was no master bedroom in the house that he used as a reference, but there was a suite on the second floor with an old mirror built into the wall. He had never checked if there was a compartment behind it. "Can you show me tomorrow?" Catherine nodded and went back to her room. Arthur stayed awake until dawn, a disturbing certainty growing in his chest. His own ex-wife had turned his property into something he had never authorized, and 2 orphan girls were living proof of secrets he still needed to uncover. The dawn arrived heavy with expectations and fears. Arthur had spent a sleepless night, poring over documents and trying to understand how 2 children could know his property with such intimacy. When he went down for breakfast, he found Catherine and Isabel already awake, sitting at the kitchen table as if that routine were natural for them. "Good morning, Uncle Arthur," said Catherine, swinging her legs on the high chair. "Isabel dreamed about Mommy last night. She was watering the roses and singing our song." Isabel nodded silently, her eyes still dreamy. She was wearing the blue dress with little flowers, the one she liked best. Arthur prepared scrambled eggs and toast, observing how the girls behaved. There was a disturbing naturalness in the way they inhabited that space, as if every corner of the house held specific memories of their lives. "Catherine, you mentioned hidden photos yesterday," he said, serving breakfast. "Can you show me where your mum kept them?" The girl nodded energetically, and after finishing her meal, led Arthur upstairs to the master suite. The room was simply furnished, with a king-size bed and an antique mirror embedded in a side wall. Arthur had never paid much attention to that mirror, assuming it was just part of the original decoration. "It's there," Catherine pointed, approaching the mirror. "Mommy would stand on a chair and press a little corner that made a noise." Arthur examined the edges of the mirror and discovered that a small section of the frame was slightly loose. When he pressed the spot Catherine indicated, a discreet mechanism activated, revealing a secret compartment behind the glass. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the contents. Photographs of Catherine and Isabel at different ages, some as babies, others already walking around the house. There were also folded documents and a sealed envelope with his own name, written in a cursive script he recognized immediately. It was Renee's handwriting. "Those are our pictures," exclaimed Isabel, climbing onto a chair to get a better look. "Look, Uncle Arthur, this one is when I lost my first tooth in the garden." Arthur picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter dated 3 years ago, along with copies of lease agreements that bore his signature, a signature he was absolutely certain he had never made. "My dearest Arthur," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you've discovered what I did with our house. I know I cannot justify myself, but I need you to understand my reasons. After you became so distant, so obsessed with work, I felt invisible in our own life. The house was always empty, you were always traveling, and I felt like I was dying of loneliness." Arthur continued to read, each word a stab in his chest. Renee recounted how she had started renting out rooms to families in need during his prolonged absences, using forged signatures and doctored documents. She specifically mentioned Christine Andrade, a widowed nurse with 2 small daughters, who had become almost like a daughter to her. Christine was a dedicated mother, struggling after losing her husband. The letter continued. She worked double shifts at the hospital to support Catherine and Isabel, but her salary barely covered the rent for a small apartment. I offered her rooms in the house in exchange for light housework and companionship. For the first time in years, our house had life, children's laughter, the smell of home-cooked food. The next revelation was devastating. Renee admitted to having forged Arthur's signature on multiple contracts, creating an informal rental scheme that served several families simultaneously. There were single mothers, elderly people with insufficient pensions, young graduates unable to afford conventional rents. "I know you will consider me a criminal," the letter went on, "but I saw entire families transform their lives because they had access to decent housing. Christine gained enough emotional stability to take better care of her daughters. The girls grew up in a safe environment, with a garden to play in and space to dream." A wave of nausea washed over Arthur. Renee had turned his most valuable property into a kind of clandestine boarding house, using his identity without consent. The worst part was realizing she had done this for years, taking advantage of his constant travels and his emotional distance. "But something went wrong," the letter continued. "Christine began to show signs of severe depression. She worked too much, slept too little, and I realized I was losing control of the situation. When I tried to help her seek medical treatment, I found out she didn't have regular residency documents, which complicated access to public health services." Arthur stopped reading when he heard Catherine call him. The girl had found a shoebox at the back of the secret compartment, filled with colored pencil drawings. They were clearly childish drawings, but they depicted the house in precise detail. The rose garden, the kitchen, the butterfly room, even the office where he now spent most of his time. "I made these to show Mommy how pretty our house was," Catherine explained. "She kept them all because she said we were artists." "And this one," said Isabel, showing a drawing where 3 female figures were hugging, "is me, Catherine, and Mommy on the day we got here. Mommy cried with joy because we finally had a real home." The girl's words echoed in Arthur's mind as he resumed reading. Renee described how Christine's mental state deteriorated rapidly in the last few months. They lived in the house. The nurse began to miss work, showed signs of paranoia, and was eventually fired for professional negligence. "When Christine lost her job, I didn't know how to help," Renee admitted in the letter. "She had an emotional breakdown, talked about hurting herself, neglected the girl's care. I tried to convince her to find her family, but she insisted she had no one. That's when I made the decision that changed everything." The next page revealed the final betrayal. Renee had turned Christine over to the mental health authorities, claiming she had found a woman in a psychotic episode abandoning 2 children. To protect her clandestine rental scheme, she invented a story about Christine being a problematic tenant who had fled, leaving her daughters behind. "I lied, Arthur. I lied to everyone. I said Christine had abandoned the children and disappeared without a trace. In reality, she was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric clinic in Denver, but when social services arrived to get Catherine and Isabel, they had already run away. They spent weeks looking for them until they found them wandering the streets." Arthur dropped the letter, feeling physically sick. His ex-wife had not only used his property illegally, but had also separated a family, lied to authorities, and abandoned 2 children to their fate to protect her crimes. "Uncle Arthur, are you okay?" asked Catherine, touching his hand. "You turned all white, just like Mommy used to when she felt sick." "I'm fine, honey," he lied, folding the letter. "Let's go downstairs and have some juice. How about that?" While the girls played in the living room, Arthur called Martha Evans, the social worker. "Martha, I've discovered important information about the girl's mother. I need to know about a woman named Christine Andrade who may have been admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Denver about 3 months ago." "I'll check our records and contact the institutions in the region," Martha replied. "Mr. Blackwood, what exactly did you discover?" Arthur hesitated. Telling the truth meant admitting that his property had been used illegally for years, which could result in huge legal complications. But looking at Catherine and Isabel, who were drawing peacefully on the living room floor, he felt he could no longer protect Renee's secrets. "I found out that my ex-wife rented out rooms in this house without my permission. Christine and the girls lived here for about 2 years. There are documents that prove everything." The silence on the other end of the line was long. "Mr. Blackwood, this is a very serious situation. We need to meet today to discuss the next steps. If this woman really is the children's mother and she's institutionalized—" "I know," Arthur interrupted. "I'll do whatever it takes to reunite this family. It's the least I can do after everything they've been through because of my ex-wife's crimes." After hanging up, Arthur returned to his office and finished reading Renee's letter. The last lines were a bitter farewell and a plea for forgiveness that he knew he could never grant. "I know you can never forgive me, and I don't deserve forgiveness. I only hope that one day you can help these families I have harmed so much. The money I took is in an account for which I've attached the details. Use it to repair the damage we caused. Goodbye, Arthur. You were always a better person than I deserved." Arthur found the attached bank details and discovered that Renee had left an account with nearly $500,000, likely part of the money she had stolen from him mixed with profits from the rental scheme. That afternoon, when Martha returned with information about Christine, the confirmation was accompanied by devastating details. Christine Andrade had been a patient at the Hope Clinic in Denver for exactly 3 months, in a catatonic state caused by severe depression and psychological trauma. According to the doctors, she constantly repeats the names Catherine and Isabel, but did not respond when asked about family or children, Martha explained. Her condition is serious, but Dr. Henry Castle, who is in charge of her case, believes that a reunion with her daughters, it could be crucial for her recovery. Arthur looked at the girls, who had fallen asleep huddled together on the living room sofa, and made a decision that would change not only their lives, but also his own. The next day they would go to Denver. It was time to try to repair at least some of the harm that his neglect and Renee's malice had caused. But first, he needed to prepare to face the legal consequences of everything his ex-wife had done in his name, and to find out how many other families had been harmed by the criminal scheme that had operated for years right under his nose. The drive to Denver was marked by Arthur's tense silence and the girls' anxious anticipation. Catherine and Isabel had spent the morning preparing drawings to show their mother, talking excitedly about how happy she would be to see them. Arthur didn't have the heart to explain that Christine might not be able to recognize them immediately. The Hope Clinic stood as a stark white building in the city center. Dr. Henry Castle received them in his office, a middle-aged man with kind eyes that showed the experience of someone who had witnessed much human suffering. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to prepare you for what you are about to see," the doctor said, while the girls played in the waiting room with a nurse. "Christine has been in a catatonic state for 3 months. She doesn't speak, doesn't respond to external stimuli, and shows severe signs of psychological trauma. She only repeats her daughter's names in occasional whispers." "What caused this?" Arthur asked, a growing sense of guilt in his chest. "From the records we have, she was found in a state of psychosis in a rundown apartment in Aspen. She had lost her job, was out of money for rent, and had apparently been evicted with her daughters. The person who brought her to us claimed she had abandoned the children, but Christine insists on whispering that they are lost. I need to find my girls." Arthur clenched his fists. Every detail confirmed the manipulated version Renee had created to cover her crimes. "Doctor, I have information that could completely change the understanding of this case. Christine did not abandon her daughters. She was the victim of a criminal scheme that resulted in the forced separation of her family. Dr. Castle leaned forward, interested. Arthur recounted the entire discovery. Renee's letter, the forged contracts, the period Christine and the girls lived on his property, and how his ex-wife had orchestrated the family's separation to protect her own crimes. "This changes everything," the doctor said after hearing the full account. "If Christine didn't abandon her daughters, but believes she lost them through her own negligence, it explains the trauma that led to her catatonic state. The guilt and desperation may have been the main triggers." "Can the girls see her?" "Yes, but I need to prepare them. And you should be aware that her reaction could be unpredictable. Sometimes, when patients in a catatonic state are faced with emotionally intense situations, they can have crises or, conversely, moments of sudden lucidity." Christine's room was small and lit by natural light. She was sitting in a chair near the window, staring into space with an empty expression. She was a young woman, appearing to be in her early 30s, with unkempt brown hair and simple hospital clothes. Her thin hands rested in her lap, and she rocked slightly back and forth. When Catherine and Isabel entered the room, they stopped immediately at the door. The transformation in their expressions was painful to watch. The joyful expectation turned to confusion and fear. "Mommy?" Catherine whispered, approaching slowly. Christine didn't react. She continued to look out the window as if her daughters were invisible. "Mommy, it's us, Catherine and Isabel." Isabel tried, her small voice breaking slightly. "We found our house again, the house with the rose garden." For a moment, Arthur thought he saw a tremor in Christine's hands, but she remained motionless. "Mommy, I brought you new drawings," Catherine said, getting closer and placing the sheets of paper on her mother's lap. "This one is you watering the flowers, just like you did every morning." It was then that it happened. Christine lowered her eyes to the drawing, and her hands trembled visibly. Her lips moved, forming silent words, until finally a sound came out. "My girls," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Yes, Mommy, we're your girls," exclaimed Isabel, running to hug her mother. What followed was a moment of pure emotion. Christine began to cry, first silently, then with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her wounded soul. She hugged her daughters with desperate strength, as if afraid they would disappear again. I thought you were lost," she managed to say between tears. I couldn't take care of you. I'm a terrible mother." "No, Mommy," said Catherine, wiping the tears from her mother's face with her small hands. "You're the best mom in the world. We looked for you until we found our house again." Dr. Castle watched the scene with professional admiration and personal emotion. This is the first time in 3 months she has shown any kind of recognition or emotional response, he murmured to Arthur. But the joy of the reunion was interrupted when Christine looked at Arthur for the first time. Her eyes filled with terror, and she pulled her daughters closer. "No, you can't take them from me again," she said, her voice gaining strength in desperation. "Please, don't take my girls away from me." Arthur felt his heart break. "Christine, I didn't come to separate you. I came to help reunite your family." She stared at him with suspicion, clearly not understanding who he was or why he was there. Dr. Castle approached gently. "Christine, this is Mr. Arthur Blackwood. He found out where you and the girls lived before, and he brought your daughters here to see you." "The house, our beautiful house," Christine murmured, looking again at the drawings in her lap. "You still remember the house?" "Of course, Mommy. And Uncle Arthur said we can go back there," Isabel said with innocence. Arthur felt the weight of that unconsciously made promise. The legal complications of everything Renee had done were yet to be resolved, and he didn't know if it would be possible to keep this hope the girls had created. Over the next 2 hours, Dr. Castle conducted careful family therapy sessions, allowing Christine to gradually process her daughter's presence and begin to recover fragments of memory from the last few months. With the girl's help, she slowly reconstructed the events that led to the separation. "I remember being very sad," Christine said, lucidity slowly returning. "I lost my job at the hospital. I couldn't pay our share for the house anymore. Renee said we had to leave, but that she would find another place for us. After that, everything got confusing." "Renee lied to you," Arthur explained gently. "She invented a story about you abandoning the girls to cover up the crimes. She was committing." The revelation was devastating for Christine. Discovering that she had been betrayed by someone she trusted, that her daughters had been deliberately taken from her, triggered a new wave of emotions that Dr. Castle had to manage carefully. "Does that mean I'm not a bad mother? I didn't abandon my daughters?" she asked, desperately seeking confirmation. "You were never a bad mother," said Catherine, kissing her mother's face. "You always took care of us, and now we'll be together forever." When they left the clinic at the end of the day, Dr. Castle spoke privately with Arthur about the next steps. Christine would need intensive psychological treatment to fully overcome the trauma, but the reunion with her daughters had already produced significant results. She could be discharged in a few weeks, provided she has psychiatric follow-up and a stable environment to live with the children, the doctor explained. "She will have it," Arthur promised, making a decision he knew would change his life forever. During the drive back to Aspen, the girls fell asleep in the back seat, emotionally exhausted from the reunion. Arthur drove in silence, processing everything he had witnessed. He saw in Christine's eyes the same desperation and determination he himself had felt when he lost everything 15 years ago. When they arrived home, they found Martha Tavares waiting with documents that completely changed the course of the situation. Lawsuits were being filed against Arthur by families who discovered that the lease agreements signed by Renee were fraudulent. 3 different families had sought lawyers after being evicted when the true owners discovered their presence on the properties. "The situation is serious, Mr. Blackwood," Martha explained. "Although you were a victim of your ex-wife's crimes, legally you are still responsible for the damages caused to the families who believed they were living legitimately on your properties." Arthur read the documents while the girls played in the living room, oblivious to the legal storm that was brewing. There were damage claims that could consume his entire net worth, and questions about his suitability as the children's temporary guardian. "And there's another complication," Martha continued. "We discovered that Renee didn't just forge contracts on your properties. She also ran a charitable organization that received donations to help families in need. There is evidence that she diverted these funds to finance her own lifestyle." The final revelation was like a punch to the gut. Renee had not only ruined the lives of Christine and her daughters, she had deceived dozens of well-intentioned donors and harmed countless families who depended on help that never reached them. That night, while Catherine and Isabel slept, Arthur stood on the porch looking at the rose garden the girls loved so much. For the first time in 15 years, he faced the possibility of losing everything again. But this time, it wouldn't just be his fortune at risk, it would be the chance to give a family back to 2 children who had already suffered too much. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was an unknown number. "Arthur Blackwood?" a female voice said on the other end of the line. "Yes." "My name is Anne-Marie Sawyer. I am the lawyer for the families harmed by your ex-wife's fraudulent contracts. I need to speak with you about something very important that could change this entire situation." Arthur closed his eyes, bracing himself for another twist in a story that seemed to have no end. "What did you discover?" We found Renee. The revelation that Renee had been found brought a mixture of relief and apprehension that kept Arthur awake until dawn. Anne-Marie Sawyer had scheduled a meeting for the next morning at her office, promising information that could completely change the outcome of the lawsuits. When Arthur arrived at the lawyer's office, he found a determined woman in her 40s, surrounded by stacks of documents and evidence she had collected over months of investigation. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to prepare yourself for what I'm about to reveal," Anne-Marie said, gesturing for him to sit. "Renee didn't just commit the crimes you already know about. We've discovered she ran a much broader and more sophisticated fraud scheme over the last 5 years." Anne opened a folder filled with bank statements, contracts, and photographs. "Your ex-wife created at least 6 different false identities, rented properties in 5 cities in the region, and managed a network of fraudulent leases that moved more than $2 million. A wave of nausea washed over Arthur. Where is she now? In custody in Salt Lake City for the past 3 weeks, on charges of fraud and forgery. But here's the part that intrigues me the most," said Anne, pulling a digital recorder from her drawer. "She specifically requested to speak with you, said she has information that could completely exonerate you and resolve the situation for the harmed families. Do you believe her?" Anne hesitated. "Renee is an expert manipulator, but this time she has nothing to gain by lying. She's facing a sentence that could be up to 15 years in prison. If she really has information that can help the victims of her crimes, it might be her attempt to reduce her sentence." 2 hours later, Arthur was sitting in a visiting room at the Women's Correctional Facility in Salt Lake City, waiting for the meeting he had avoided for 5 years. When Renee entered, escorted by a corrections officer, he barely recognized her. The elegant, vain woman who had been his wife was thin, with unkempt graying hair and deep, dark circles under her eyes. "Arthur," she said, sitting in front of him, unable to make eye contact, "thank you for coming. Anne-Marie said you have important information." Renee nodded, pulling out a folder of documents that the lawyer had allowed her to bring. "I know where all the money I stole is, and I know how to reverse the damage I caused to the families, including Christine and her daughters." Over the next 3 hours, Renee revealed details of a scheme that surpassed anything Arthur had imagined. She had created bank accounts under false names, acquired properties using forged documents, and established a network of accomplices that included real estate agents, corrupt public officials, and even some of the tenants she had deceived. "The charity was just the tip of the iceberg," she admitted. "I received donations from good faith businessmen like you, but I also laundered money from other illegal sources. Christine and the other families were victims, but they were also, unknowingly, part of a larger scheme." "Why are you telling me this now?" Renee finally looked into his eyes, and Arthur saw something he didn't expect to find: genuine remorse. "Because I found out that Christine tried to harm herself several times during her hospitalization. And because I heard that Catherine and Isabel ask every day if their mother will be able to take care of them again." Her voice broke slightly. "Those girls called me Aunt Renee when they lived in our house. They would hug me when I came home from work, draw cards for me on Mother's Day, and I destroyed their family to protect my crimes." The confession that followed was devastating. Renee revealed that she had deliberately manipulated Christine's psychological condition, providing her with unprescribed anxiety medication, creating stressful situations to keep her emotionally dependent, and finally orchestrating her breakdown when she realized authorities were closing in on her investigation. "Christine didn't develop depression naturally," Renee admitted. "I systematically drugged her for months, mixing sedatives in her tea to keep her confused and dependent. When she started asking questions about the lease agreements, I increased the dosage until she lost the ability to reason clearly." Arthur felt a rage he hadn't experienced in years. You poisoned a single mother to protect your crimes. You deliberately separated two children from their mother. Yes, Renee whispered, and I have the recordings that prove everything. I documented every step of what I did, thinking I might one day need the information to protect myself. I never imagined it would be to try to fix the evil I caused. Renee handed him a flash drive containing audio recordings, videos, and documents that proved not only her guilt, but also the complete innocence of all the harmed families, including Christine. There are $15 million in accounts I created using false identities, she continued. Not just what I stole from you, but profits from 5 years of fraudulent schemes. I want to transfer everything to a fund that will benefit the families I harmed. And in return, nothing. I want nothing in return, only that you give this evidence to the authorities and help Christine regain custody of her daughters, and that you tell the girls that Aunt Renee is very sorry for what she did. When Arthur returned to Aspen that afternoon, he found Catherine and Isabel anxiously waiting for news about when they could visit their mother again. What he didn't expect was to find Dr. Henry Castle talking with Martha Tavares in his living room. "Mr. Blackwood, we have important news about Christine," the doctor said. "She has had a remarkable recovery in the last few days. She is lucid, cooperative, and shows positive anxiety to be permanently reunited with her daughters." "And medically?" "We ran blood tests after our conversation about the possibility of her having been medicated without consent. We found traces of benzodiazepines in concentrations that suggest prolonged use at high doses. If she was indeed drugged as you suspect, it completely explains her psychological collapse." Arthur handed the flash drive to Martha and recounted Renee's entire confession. The revelations instantly changed the legal status of everyone involved. Christine would not only regain custody of her daughters, but would also be considered a victim of poisoning and psychological manipulation. 3 weeks later, Christine was discharged from the hospital and returned to Aspen. The reunion with her daughters at home was emotional, but what surprised everyone was the proposal Arthur made that same afternoon. "Christine, I know you lost everything because of my ex-wife's crimes," he said as they watched the girls play in the rose garden. "The house where you were happy is for sale for $20 million. I have a proposal that might seem strange, but I'd like you to consider it." He explained that the $15 million recovered from Renee would be divided among all the harmed families, but that Christine would be entitled to the largest share as the main victim of the crimes. With that amount, she could acquire the house where they had been happy and still have resources to start a new life. "But that wouldn't be fair to me," Christine protested. "This has always been your property." "Actually, no," Arthur replied with a smile. "I discovered something in the last few days. When my father built this house 40 years ago, he registered it as a family trust, not individual property. Technically, any family that demonstrated a genuine emotional bond with the property would have legal rights to it." The final revelation came when Arthur showed Christine documents he had found in his father's files. The house had been specifically designed to shelter families in difficulty as part of a social project his father had developed before. "He passed away. My father always dreamed that this house would serve families who needed a real home," Arthur explained. "Renee perverted that vision by using it for crimes, but you turned it into the loving home he always imagined." 6 months later, Christine had established herself as a nurse at a private hospital in Aspen. The girls attended a local school where they flourished socially and academically, and the rose garden had never been more beautiful. Arthur, for his part, discovered that his true calling was not in accumulating properties, but in using his resources to help other families find stability. He created a housing assistance fund that helped single mothers acquire their own homes, inspired by the lesson Catherine and Isabel had taught him about the true meaning of home. On Christmas Eve, as he watched the girls decorate the tree in the living room of the house they now officially called their own, Arthur reflected on how two small children had appeared at his door to return not only a lost family, but also his own humanity. "Uncle Arthur," said Catherine, interrupting his thoughts, "Mommy said you're going to spend Christmas with us every year now." "If you'll have me," he replied, smiling. "Of course, you're part of our family now," said Isabel, running to hug him. And as the sun set over the mountains surrounding Aspen, Arthur understood that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what really matters, that the true wealth of a life is not measured in properties or bank accounts, but in the bonds of love and protection we build with those who need us. Catherine and Isabel didn't just find their way back home. They helped a man lost in his own life discover the true meaning of family. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.